All right, so my name is Brandon Vaidyanathan. I'm the chair of the sociology department here at Catholic University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome two visiting panelists here. Professor Michael Brown, to my immediate left, is professor of management and the Samuel Patton and Marion Towdy Black Chair in Business at Penn State Erie, the Barron College in Erie, Pennsylvania. He's the director of the Barron Honors Program and campus coordinator for the Schreyer Honors College. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in the area of management, negotiations, leadership, and ethics. His current research interests include ethical leadership, moral conflict, moral diversity, and other aspects of behavioral ethics. To my far left is Professor Gary Weaver, who's a professor of management at the University of Delaware's Alfred Lerner College of Business and Economics. He teaches graduate courses on ethics in organizations and has published research on ethics in organizations in leading management journals and co-authored Managing Ethics in Business Organizations, Social Scientific Perspectives from Stanford University Press. Previously, he was editor-in-chief of Business Ethics Quarterly and has been a visiting professor at the University of Zurich's Institute for Organization and Administrative Science. And unlike Professor Brown, he holds 2 PhDs, not just one. Please welcome Professor Brown and Professor Weaver.
Thank you. That is true, by the way. He does have 2 PhDs, so he will sound 2 times smarter than I do. So, on behalf of Gary, we'd like to thank Catholic University, the Catholic Project, the entire staff of the Institute for Human Ecology for organizing this series and inviting us to present. We've been asked to examine the root causes of the crisis in the church through a lens of organizational behavior research. Before we can proceed, we must address the question, what is organizational behavior? Organizational behavior, or OB for short, is an interdisciplinary social science focused on behavior in and by organizations. Organizational behavior research looks at individuals, groups, and organizations across a variety of settings, including small businesses, large multinational corporations, and both profit and not-for-profit organizations. There are many subspecialties in our field, including scholarship that focuses on understanding ethical and unethical behavior in organizations. Organizational behavior research is grounded in social scientific theories and research methods. OB researchers collect and analyze various types of data, most commonly gathered from surveys and interviews of key constituencies, to better understand how and why people actually behave in organizations. Although the Catholic Church is clearly unique, we believe that examining the causes of the crisis through a lens of organizational behavior is appropriate. After all, the biggest dioceses have hundreds of millions in assets, millions of Catholics, thousands of lay employees in schools, parishes, diocesan administration, and other ministries, as well as hundreds of priests. Even small dioceses are relatively complex organizations within their geographical areas. As an organization, the church deals with many of the same issues found in businesses. Issues related to money, power, internal politics, control, effective and ineffective leadership, and frequent examples of actual practice deviating from formal policies and rules. Needless to say, administering a diocese can be challenging. In these ways, the church has more in common with secular organizations than we might expect. In this session, our objective is to identify potential causes of the crisis from among the list of many factors that have been associated with unethical behavior in OB research. It is important to establish some boundaries of our discussion. First, I would like to emphasize we have no special insights into the details of what caused the crisis. That would require a large-scale research study based on multi-source data. The John Jay reports offer some insights into the causes of the crisis. However, those investigations were not conducted from an OB perspective. The John Jay researchers were criminologists, and the reports were focused on the sexual abuse of minors, which is perhaps only one, albeit very important, element of the larger crisis facing the church. Ultimately, to draw firm conclusions about what happened based on an OB perspective will require additional data collection and analysis. Second, we cannot address this crisis from a theological perspective. For example, OB research methods do not allow us to test the role of the demonic as a potential cause of the crisis. And as we heard in the earlier session, which was a much more systematic investigation through that lens. Especially when addressing the crisis in the church, accounts that do not consider theologically informed categories and analyses will be incomplete. Third, we also admit to not being lawyers, civil or canon, and thus are not qualified to address the issues from such a perspective. Insofar as canon law addresses church structure, organization, and leadership, any insights from an OB perspective must be considered in light of existing law. In the first two conferences of this series, presenters observed that there are many often competing views of what the crisis is and what it is not. One cannot study a problem and propose solution until one identifies what it entails. In other words, we must define what the crisis is before we can study it. So what do we mean by the crisis? The sexual abuse of children by clergy has been most widely discussed, but there are other aspects to the crisis that can, and we argue should, be considered, such as the abuse of teens and vulnerable adults, predation in seminaries and the priesthood, widespread unchaste behavior among the clergy, failures of monitoring and detection. How could such scandalous behavior have gone unnoticed? Silence. Why didn't priests and bishops who knew about misconduct speak up? Leadership. The mishandling of abuse cases by church leaders, including inadequate responses and attempts to cover it up. Note, this issue is not limited to our bishops. There are important questions about the Vatican's handling of these issues as well. Last but not least, for many, the spark that reignited the crisis is the McCarrick scandal. How did he advance to a high position? How did any bishop credibly accused of misconduct advance to his position? Diverging viewpoints on what constitutes the crisis might help explain its mishandling. What some consider the primary problems, others might consider secondary or even a non-issue, which makes consistent and effective responses potentially more difficult to achieve. Overall, we believe that attempts to impose a single definition of the crisis is unnecessary and detrimental to identifying and correcting the underlying causes of the crisis. For the purposes of our presentation, we believe it's best to define the crisis broadly as consisting of all of the above elements, as well as others that we have not articulated here. Having said that, we acknowledge that understanding how McCarrick happened is especially important to many American Catholics. Gary, next, will begin to provide an overview of key insights from organizational behavior that are relevant to better understanding the causes of and solutions for the crisis in one or more of its dimensions.
Thank you, Mike. Our goal here is to encourage essentially the throwing of a very wide net in considering potential origins of and solutions to the crisis. It's often tempting in the face of ethical failures to look for individual actors responsible, the bad actors, the bad apples. But to continue the agricultural analogy, apples sometimes go bad if they're packed poorly, if the orchard is managed poorly, and subject to a host of difficult influences from the outside. So I'll start by focusing on formal and informal organizational responses to ethical failures, thinking of the organization rather than so much the individuals in the organization. Of course, the relationship between an organization and its members is not one-directional, although I will focus on organizational factors that influence ethical and unethical behavior. Those organizational factors, whether formal policies or informal practices, at some point emerge from and are sustained by the actions and decisions of people. It's an ongoing process of mutual influence, often without a clearly identifiable starting point. In addition, I will add the proviso that it's entirely possible that different organizational factors contribute to particular problems in different parts of the church, a particular parish, diocese, etc. It's rather normal for organizations, and including probably the church, to have multiple elements that in fact might be loosely connected with each other, such that policies and practices in one part have little impact on practices elsewhere. That some observers point to uneven implementation of the Dallas Charter, for example, indicates that loosely connected practices indeed can occur in the church, like any other large, complex organization. I'm first going to address the formal side of fostering appropriate and good behavior in organizations, by which I mean the rules, policies, formal procedures, official programs, initiatives, monitoring procedures, discipline, and similar sorts of elements. These are the kinds of things that are often introduced immediately after a scandal, in part because they can be easily documented and thus publicized as evidence that the organization has done something. Such formal policies and structures are important, but by themselves can generate a marginally effective check-the-box attitude, or create a climate of fear and potentially a sense that individuals are being scapegoated or hounded to protect the institution. Specifically, formal procedures, formal approaches need to be matched informally by supportive behavior from people in leadership positions and by efforts to embed concern for proper action into the taken-for-granted norms or culture of the organization, so that rules, policies, and structures are perceived as sources of support, an extension of who we are and want to be, rather than as signs of distrust or suspicion. As in the case of a manager who told me that his organization's ethics and compliance office would be the very last place he would go if he were dealing with an ethical problem in his unit, because of the kind of distrust it had generated. Taken for granted beliefs and assumptions, cultural norms, and leaders' behaviors typically have bigger impacts on organizational ethics than anything formal and, importantly, help frame perceptions of the formal policies and programs. Focusing on rules, formal programs, monitoring, discipline, etc., alone can lead to an unhelpful don't-get-caught attitude with no deep commitment to the principles or goals putatively animating the rules and regulations. Alone, these also can lead to perceptions that the talk of following policy and doing the right thing is little more than an effort to protect people in leadership positions and push blame for problems down to lower levels of the organization. When that kind of perception is afoot, organizations risk worse, not better behavior, as people go into a self-protective kind of get what you can before they get you attitude. Having issued those warnings, however, it is still true that rules, policies, programs, discipline, and such are important. People expect to see violators disciplined, and those formal elements can be used to help support and embed right and proper behavior. They have symbolic value. To be effective, though, ethics policies and programs need to apply to everyone without exception. Training and formation with regard to a policy needs to be directed to everyone, not just lower-ranking persons, or again, it creates or risks creating the perception that the policy is there to protect a hierarchy with resulting negative outcomes at lower levels. Staying on top of potential or actual ethical problems requires awareness of the problem. We know, however, that in some cases clergy misconduct was known to a bishop but hidden. But sometimes clergy misconduct never was reported to anyone who could do anything about it. So what can be done to create better awareness and reporting of actual and potential problems? This does not mean cameras in the sacristy, as you might find in a commercial establishment. But it does mean that persons in responsible positions need to have ears to the ground and actively build and maintain relationships of support and trust that enable them to better know that what is occurring and that encourage others who know something to come forward. They also need to develop the personal influence and relational and communication skills so as to be able to effectively act on that information. People who observe problems but do not report them to responsible persons sometimes hold back because they fear retaliation or do not trust the responsible person, but they often hold back because they are not convinced the responsible person has the will or ability to do anything about it. Important in encouraging the reporting of misconduct is the idea that by helping the organization address a problem, one is actually being loyal to its long-term welfare. In other words, that taking note of and acting upon actual or potential problems is part of one's role. And organizations need procedures as I understand exists now in the Baltimore Archdiocese, or at least informal norms for what people can do when the responsible person to whom one normally should report is part of the problem. Failure to follow through on formal ethics and behavior policies has negative impacts, not just by further encouraging an offender to continue in bad behavior, but also because of the message it provides vicariously and symbolically to others about what the organization truly cares about. So in facing its current crisis, the Church needs to be attentive to whether the punishment it has used with regard to offenses has been of appropriate quality, quantity, and consistency. For example, might there be a sense in some quarters that condemning someone verbally or in writing is good enough, in contrast to more formal disciplines such as dismissal? This is important. Research has shown that weak punishments can be worse than no punishments at all because of the way they shift the framing of people's actions toward a kind of self-interested cost-benefit analysis, in which concerns of ethics, commitment to the organization's standards, and any sense of personal guilt or shame get shunted aside. Instead, the punishment establishes a kind of calculative mindset. Are the self-interested benefits of the bad behavior worth the risks of the punishment? But in the face of weak punishment, that trade-off can look attractive. Matters of who gets ahead also send a powerful message for better or worse. So rewards can be as important as who gets punished. Allowing people to advance organizationally despite clear violations of policy sends a message to others about what the organization considers important and unimportant. A manufacturing company I visited illustrated a good connection between ethical behavior and rewards in this regard. The particular executive I was talking to happened to discuss a case of a $50 million mistake somebody had made. In this particular case, the company viewed that $50 million mistake as a $50 million investment in that particular employee's future at the company. That is, it was a learning experience, an investment in the employee, because the company very well embodied and represented the company's stance about good business practices and good business ethics. By contrast, somebody who did not have that reputation would have found that $50 million mistake leading right to the exit door. Now, those kinds of actions by people in leadership positions are a key influence on organizational culture, that is, on the norms, taken for granted beliefs and attitudes, practices, routines, etc., regarding behavior, relationships, status, implicit goals, the use of language and symbols, and many other elements of organizational life. The influences of such factors can be subtle. Research by Scott Reynolds and colleagues at the University of Washington, for example, indicates that persons' decision-making about ethical questions in a workplace environment can be influenced by factors seemingly as subtle as the design of a logo or watermark on company stationery. There's a strong connection between some informal and cultural elements of organizations and unethical behavior, at least in secular organizations, which admittedly are the typical site of empirical research on these matters. Norms and practices that can sustain or encourage unethical behavior include, for example, entrenched patterns of rationalizing bad behavior so as to save face or avoid embarrassment, either for individuals or for the organization. Norms of keeping quiet about problems, established perhaps because the last person who raised the question about a potential problem found that the person in the leadership position shot the messenger. Patterns of not holding people responsible for the problems they create, allowing them to pass them off to a successor. An emphasis on goals achieved rather than the means used to achieve them. Practices of treating formal policies as meaningless window dressing with a wink and a nod, or routines of emphasizing the letter of the policy rather than its underlying spirit or deeper purpose. And euphemistic language that hides bad behavior, calling, for example, blatantly deceptive practices toward a customer as simply a kind of ambitious sales practice. The actions of people in leadership positions are a major influence on the development of organizational culture. Organization members look to them for informal cues about how to behave and what to think. If they handle themselves well, in ways Mike will discuss shortly, leaders can have a powerful impact on organization members' perceptions of what their organization really cares about. However, senior leaders, at least, often have a less than accurate understanding about what is going on in their organization and of people's understanding of what the leader cares about. In a study Mike and I did with another colleague, we described it as a lovely at-the-top phenomenon. People will tend to tell leaders what they think the leader wants to hear and will keep a leader from hearing bad news, and thus people in leadership position run the risk of having a much prettier picture of their organization than is warranted. There's no reason this cannot happen in the church as well. A bishop or other leader might be surrounded by subordinates who, for one reason or another, don't want to question the leader or even report problems to the leader, thinking either the boss won't be happy or the boss won't really care anyway. This is not necessarily something sinister. Rather, it indicates that people in leadership positions need to be sure that their confidants and helpers are not filtering the information that is passed on, perhaps just thinking that the boss has enough on his plate already. Leaders need to be vocal about wanting to hear bad news and attend to anything that might block that perception. Mike now is going to talk more about leader behaviors, but note that some popular explanations of the crisis have, in one way or another, implicated organizational culture, whether referring to a culture of clericalism, a gay subculture, or whatever else. But it's likely that there are more informal cultural elements than just one of those in contributing to a crisis of the current magnitude. And thus it's also likely that some of what is involved in the crisis consists of processes and practices that might not be unique to the church, but that have led to crises in other organizations as well.
As Gary noted, one of the most important influences on behavior in organizations of all types is leadership. Thus, when it comes to the crisis in the church, any examination of its root causes must include the church's leaderships. Bishops, who are essentially the CEOs of their dioceses, are perhaps the most important level of leadership to examine. Looking across the United States, we see important differences in how bishops have dealt with the crisis. We are all too familiar with accounts of bishops who mishandled claims involving the abuse of minors and other types of sexual misconduct. However, there are those who have handled the crisis well. Take, for example, in my diocese of Erie, Pennsylvania. Our bishop, Lawrence Persico, took a very different approach to the Pennsylvania grand jury investigation. He was the only bishop to testify before the grand jury. He published the names of credibly accused clergy and lay workers in this diocese well before the grand jury report was released, and he was the first bishop to call for the release of the report, as painful as that was. Bishop Persico is an example of one of the many good guys that exist among our bishops today. And it's important that although we're talking about a lot of the negative aspects, that we don't lose sight of all of the great priests and bishops that serve us and lead us faithfully. Much of my own research has focused on understanding ethical leadership in business organizations, what it is and why it is important. I believe an OB perspective on ethical leadership is relevant to understanding how the church's leadership might have contributed to, or at the very least, exacerbated the crisis. So what is ethical leadership from an OB perspective? We describe ethical leaders as both moral persons, that is who they are, and moral managers, that is what they do and how they lead. As a moral person, an ethical leader is someone who's recognized for having strong character and integrity. As a moral manager, an ethical leader uses the tools of leadership to promote good conduct among others. Within the context of the church, we might refine this conceptualization to say that an ethical leader, specifically a bishop, is a moral person when he is a spiritual father who is strong in his faith and supportive of and compassionate to others. As a moral manager, a bishop must encourage virtuous behavior in others. He needs to provide clear teaching, set and consistently communicate standards for personal conduct, monitor the organization for violations, and discipline those who violate those standards. Research shows that in order to demonstrate strong ethical leadership, in order to be seen as an ethical leader by those being led, a leader must be both a strong moral person and a strong moral manager. And why is that important? A bishop who is a strong ethical leader provides a personal witness as well as clear ethical guidance conveyed with the goodness of a father that inspires others to follow not out of obligation, but out of love. When either the moral person or moral manager component is missing, the bishop will be a weaker ethical leader. For example, if a bishop lives an exemplary, Christ-like life as a moral person, but is so bogged down with administrative duties that he doesn't get out into the field, or if he's seen as soft on handling cases of misconduct, he might be a very solid moral person, but he is not demonstrating strong moral management. On the other hand, if a bishop talks tough about crisis-related issues, but doesn't practice what he preaches, for example, he's leading a double life, he will be seen as hypocritically inconsistent and therefore a weak ethical leader. Undoubtedly, failed ethical leadership among our bishops is an important cause of the crisis, not only because many bishops mishandled cases of sexual abuse, but also because some bishops have themselves abused minors, sexually harassed adults, and in some cases, done both. Just this past month, we've learned more about the credible allegations and investigations against the former bishops of Wheeling, Charleston, West Virginia, Mandeville, Jamaica, and Oran, Argentina. All of these bishops ultimately resigned their positions. The harm done to victims of abuse and sexual misconduct is horrific. When church leaders are the ones committing the misconduct and abuse, the damage it causes extends very far beyond their immediate victims. Their actions have a corrupting effect on other bishops and priests and the entire church. The late therapist and counselor, Richard Sipe, studied clergy sexual abuse and misconduct and sexual behavior for many decades. Although Sipe was not a researcher in the traditional sense, his investigations uncovered uncomfortable truths about sexual misconduct committed by priests and bishops. Many of Sipe's conclusions have been supported by subsequent research. Among these truths include the existence of a culture of hypocrisy and secrecy among some church leaders. According to Sipe, the problem of clergy sexual abuse is a top-down phenomenon. And I should add here, this is true in business organizations. When we see scandals, when we see Enron and WorldCom and whatever the latest scandal is, because there's many, it's usually a top-down phenomenon. To quote Sipe, when men in authority, cardinals, bishops, rectors, abbots, confessors, professors, are having or have had an unacknowledged secret active sex life under the guise of celibacy, an atmosphere of tolerance of behaviors within the system is made operative. Sipe claimed that the sexual abuse of minors was related to the larger problem of sexual activity of bishops and priests, because in part, those who are sexually active are reluctant to voice concerns about the misconduct of others, lest their own transgressions become exposed. Another reason why is what Sipe called genealogies of abuse. According to Sipe, and I quote, often the history of clergy abusers reveals that the priest himself was abused, and we know this from the John Jay report. Sometimes that abuse was by a priest. The abuse may have occurred when the priest was a child, but not necessarily. Sexual activity between an older priest and an adult seminarian or a younger priest sets up a pattern of institutional secrecy. When one of the parties rises to a position of power, his friends are in line also for recommendations and advancements. Sipe claimed that he was able to trace some instances of abuse to the third generation, meaning that a priest who was an abuser was himself abused by a priest, who in turn had been abused by a priest. Again, Sipe's work is not necessarily scientific, but it has proven accurate enough to merit further investigation into the origins of bad leadership in the church. Given bishops move from diocese to diocese, as noted in our previous session, as they progress through the ranks and during their careers, Sipes' research might explain how abuse spread like a contagion. If a weak ethical leader or a corrupted individual from one diocese was moved to a leadership position in another. There are two other main implications of Sipes' work. First, that bad ethical leadership in the form of weak moral managers who mishandled cases, as well as weak moral persons who themselves abused, was likely an important cause of the crisis. Again, it starts at the top. Second, and perhaps less obvious, the crisis itself might have been enabled by weak ethical leadership, because it was allowed to persist through a culture of secrecy and hypocrisy, and by the legacies of the genealogies of abuse. There are other aspects of leadership that are potentially worth examining from an OB perspective. I won't say more about the misuse of power and influence, because it was already addressed in the previous session. However, another likely factor is the phenomenon of obedience to authority, which Gary mentioned briefly. Some may be familiar with Dr. Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority experiments that were conducted in the late 1950s and 1960s. Milgram found that many well-intentioned individuals would do bad things if directed to do so by a legitimate authority figure. Sometimes those directives could even be implicit. Obedience to authority, both formal and informal, is prevalent throughout the church. If you're like me, many Catholics in the room might have been taught and raised that it was wrong to criticize a priest, pope, or bishop. Priests must be obedient to their bishop. Bishops and cardinals are obedient to the pope. In its most extreme form, Father Maciel, the founder of the Legionaries of Christ, exploited a very strict vow of obedience to enable his evil double life, which involved a long history of sexual abuse and sexual misconduct with children and adults, women and men. The legionary vow of obedience required a total renunciation of their judgment and will, and to never critically examine or disagree with the order. Now, obedience to authority is not inherently bad, but the potential for misuse and abuse exists. Similarly, as Gary mentioned earlier, the crisis has also revealed a shoot-the-messenger approach by some in the church, in which anyone who raises concerns is demonized or dismissed. This is counterproductive for promoting good ethics and contributes to the lovely at the top phenomenon that Gary just spoke about. It encourages people to remain quiet rather than speaking up about problems. Furthermore, insofar as the crisis has generated a variety of ad hominem attacks from all sides within the church, we must remember that attacking the person instead of the problem undermines rather than helps resolve the crisis. Strong ethical leaders promote a culture where people can voice concerns safely without fear of retribution. And this leads me to my last point about leadership. Effective leaders do not surround themselves only with those who agree with them. They must embrace decision-making processes that are based on genuine inquiry, a search for the truth, and not advocacy. They must gather and consider all the facts and follow them wherever they lead, even if it takes them to places that are perhaps taboo or politically incorrect. Any attempts to solve the crisis by narrowly focusing on a single dimension, identifying a single cause, and prematurely imposing a solution without the benefit of a systematic study and investigation will be less likely to succeed. Next, I'm going to pass it off to Gary again, who's going to explore selection, training, and socialization processes and how they may have contributed to the crisis.
Thank you. The crisis has generated attention, of course, to the seminary formation of candidates for the priesthood. The overall process of attracting and selecting candidates for any position obviously has a significant impact on the organization those candidates join. It is especially important for the priesthood, given that entry into the priesthood presumably is for life. Later, Mike will discuss the matter of individual characteristics of candidates. I want to point out the more general importance of the message that organizations send to candidates as they are being attracted and selected by the organization. The selection process is, in important ways, a potential candidate's first impression of what the organization truly is going to want from newcomers, potentially overriding prior expectations of what the position will involve. Yet, at least in the business world, it is surprising the extent to which companies that claim to value ethical business behavior, in fact, never bring it up in the recruiting or selection process, a fact which can send the message that, well, we talk about ethics, but we really care about other things. Selection decisions also sometimes can be made for the wrong reasons. So it's important to consider whether pressures of one kind or another, maintaining financial support from a diocese or coping with a shortage of priests, might encourage some seminaries to make unwise decisions about admission. Looking specifically at the formative process, organizational newcomers are in vulnerable positions. They're in a new situation and trying to develop an understanding of how things work, what is expected of them, what other people are like, how to balance competing demands, etc. Even though they might have formal training aimed at preparing them for their new situations, informal socialization is a crucial process and often is the point at which problematic behavior is replicated and normalized among newcomers in organizations. So it's important to see that the formal formative process is in harmony with the informal socialization candidates, and that the newly ordained as well receive from other seminarians, from clergy, from leaders, and whoever else they interact with, the kind of influences that will continue to form them well. So I enjoyed in the discussion after the last set of presentations, the brief comments on potentially immersing new clergy into domestic home life and things like that, just as considering alternative ways of socializing. Where there are inconsistencies, especially with regard to moral behavior, newcomers typically end up facing a choice between living with ongoing stress or, alternatively, adapting themselves to what they are learning from the people they now interact with. Ongoing stress can affect performance and ultimately lead to attrition. And adapting to normalized misconduct can be surprisingly easy, and easier than living with the stress of internal conflict. It is important then to enable well-meaning seminarians and clergy in new roles to seek help and support if they ever find themselves in an environment that is not supportive of the church's mission as one normally would expect to define it. By some accounts, a young priest, especially perhaps in a large diocese, rarely sees his bishop. So in a churchly sense, he is fatherless. In an era of clergy shortages, are today's new priests being thrust into their roles with insufficient guidance and social support without help from other priests who, so to speak, have their act together in terms of being good influences? And now back to Mike.
Next, I want to talk about role conflict. Okay, in many conversations I've had with priests, pastors, and those in church leadership, all have agreed that the bishop has an incredibly challenging and overwhelming task of juggling his dual roles as CEO of a complex organization, as well as a spiritual leader, a shepherd of his flock. Research suggests that there are many factors that make it difficult for a bishop to effectively carry out his dual roles as administrator and spiritual leader. The first has to do with something in organizational behavior we call a bottom line mentality, a type of one-dimensional thinking caused by excessive focus on securing bottom line outcomes at the expense of other priorities, that those other priorities get crowded out when we're focused on the tasks at hand. A bishop dealing with crisis-related issues can spend the majority of his time attending to the administration of his diocese. He has many worries. Will we face lawsuits? Where will the money come from? Will I have to close parishes and schools, lay off staff? How will the local media cover bad news? What will my priests think? What will people in the pews think? It is quite possible that a bishop's administrative role is so time-consuming, so overwhelming, that he has little time left over to attend to his own mental, physical, and spiritual health and well-being. Other research shows that thinking about money, even subconsciously, can make someone more prone to poor ethical decision-making. because it causes the decision maker to focus on business considerations. In the case of bishops during the abuse crisis, this might have manifested itself as an inclination to put the needs of the institution to protect its reputation, ahead of victims and a desire for secrecy instead of transparency. Taken together, these factors suggest that there's something about a bishop's role that is uniquely challenging, both within the church and across other organizations. For example, I don't know too many CEOs of business organizations, no matter how successful they are, who could succeed if they were given dual roles for administering the business and simultaneously attending to the spiritual needs of their employees and the surrounding communities. That's a tall task. This should cause us to question, to what degree does a bishop's role as CEO of a very complex organization compromise his ability to serve as a spiritual leader to his flock? Next, I'd like to turn our attention to something OB researchers call individual differences, which are the characteristics, traits, values, behavioral tendencies, emotions, identities, and cognitions of individuals. These qualities of individuals are often fairly stable over time and tend to vary from person to person. The second John Jay report, which examined the causes and consequences of the abuse crisis, concluded that situational factors, not psychological factors, were the primary cause of the crisis. Although there were some individual factors that were related to the abuse of minors, such as the abuser's post-ordination use of multiple forms of pornography and a lack of positive discussions about sexuality when the abuser was growing up. Given that organizational behavior research and other psychological research has shown that individual differences explain a great deal about human behavior, I believe it's premature to simply give up and not look for individual differences as the cause of the crisis. And in the afternoon session, I know Father Sullins has research and others that will be discussing some aspect of that. So what other factors should we look at? I offer 3 suggestions. First, in regards to bishops, one place to start is with canon law, and again, we are not canon lawyers, that it tells us about the qualities that make a man a suitable candidate for the episcopate. These qualities include outstanding and solid faith, good morals, piety, zeal for souls, wisdom, prudence, and human virtues. If these qualities are really important, we might speculate that bishops who mishandled the abuse crisis or were guilty of misconduct themselves are deficient in one or more of these qualities. If so, it would be important to determine whether the bishop always lacked those qualities, in which case we missed something in their selection, he wasn't a suitable candidate to begin with, or if the bishop became weakened or corrupted during his tenure as bishop. Those are the kind of questions we need to ask and answer. Second, in OB research, an individual's moral identity, the degree to which it is important for someone to be a moral person, has been strongly associated with ethical and pro-social behavior in organizations. Something analogous in the priesthood might be one's priestly identity, the degree to which it is important for a man to be a holy priest. I've seen a number of articles recently, including those written by priests and bishops, that identify a lack of personal holiness as the primary cause of the crisis. Although identity is usually measured as a subjective self-report, one might also measure it via behavioral indicators. For example, how often the priest prays, how frequently, the duration, intensity of prayer. Does the priest hear confessions? How often does the priest interact and minister to people in the parish? Last, and of course, how often does the priest himself go to confession? Because I've heard that as well. Many priests hear confession but don't actually go to it themselves. Last but not least, we might look to existing psychological constructs and measures for consideration. Again, in the last session, the personality disorder of narcissism came up. Some Catholic psychologists have observed that narcissism, a pattern of grandiosity, a radical need for admiration, a lack of empathy, all different aspects of that narcissistic personality disorder, might in fact have played a role in the abuse crisis. In fact, I believe that good Catholic psychologists and psychiatrists have a major role to play in identifying individual differences that might have contributed to the crisis. Simply put, one of the main conclusions about individual differences is that we need more research into this aspect of potential causes. I'm going to turn it over to Gary, who will tell us about a specific psychological mechanism, moral disengagement, that might help us better understand the psychology of an abuser.
Yes, one of the interesting facts about many of the people who commit wrong of one sort or another is that they don't see themselves as wrongdoers. They're quite comfortable in what they do fairly often. Usually what has happened is that they have rationalized or otherwise cognitively accommodated their moral failures so as to still believe they are living up to their own and others' moral expectations. This reduces or eliminates any sense of guilt or self-sanction that would accompany the moral failure, the anticipation of which normally helps motivate people toward good behavior. For example, people who commit wrongs regularly transfer responsibility to others or to their situation. The boss made me do it. They distort consequences. The victim won't miss the money. They blame a victim. If so-and-so had not followed me into the sacristy, this never would have happened. They use euphemistic language to minimize the seriousness of an offense. They engage in a kind of moral licensing or advantageous self-comparison to justify what they do. I've done so much good work for Christ that few peccadillos won't matter. And even observers, not just perpetrators, can use such rationalizations to minimize the seriousness of what they are seeing. But offering these kinds of cognitive accounts to oneself, either in anticipation of unethical action or to accommodate oneself to it after the fact, involves rhetorical resources that need to have plausibility or credibility. Thus, an embezzler appeals to widely shared notions of fairness and equity in rationalizing his crime on grounds that he is underpaid by the company and does not rationalize it on grounds that space aliens made him do it. Okay? So how do perpetrators in the church's crisis rationalize their actions so as to seemingly harmonize them with the church's moral teaching? More specifically, should the church be reflecting upon what, if anything, in its various messages and practices, even if they are misunderstood badly, might be helping to enable whatever rationalizations aided the various wrongful acts that constitute the crisis? Now, although our focus has been on internal organizational practices and individual behaviors, we can't forget the role of larger social factors as well, as noted by the John Jay report and elsewhere. For example, sexual abuse by clergy is not just a Roman Catholic problem, nor is the Roman Catholic Church the first or only institution to engage in self-protective but ultimately counterproductive practices in response to problems. Organizations functioning in particular societal context often end up imitating each other in ways that their decision makers might not be fully aware of. For example, ask the laid-off employees of the business that downsized not because it was losing money or customers, but simply an imitation of other companies in that industry. These societal and institutional influences can emerge unintentionally, but also can be guided intentionally by individuals, organizations, and institutions with influential social resources, power and status, financial resources, the ability to change narratives and frame discussion, or key positions in networks of people and organizations. Consider how the subprime mortgage crisis of roughly a decade ago centrally involved mortgage companies and banks, but the bad behavior in and by those organizations was influenced by the business press, academic theorizing, rating agencies, parallel practices in other loan sectors, institutional investors, government policy, new technologies in the construction of house appraisals, market conditions, and widespread taken-for-granted societal beliefs about the benefits of home ownership. So addressing the crisis and its causes, along with all the organizational and individual factors we have mentioned, needs to, in important ways, consider looking outside the church as well. Now, let me end my part of this on a hopeful note acknowledging that it is indeed possible for organizations to recover well from large-scale ethical crises. To use a business example, consider the massive bribery and corruption scandal that erupted in 2006 with regard to Siemens, the big German-based multinational manufacturing company. This crisis erupted a decade ago, resulting in, at the time, what at the time was the largest ever financial fine on a business, $1.6 billion paid in Germany and the United States. This hurt the company through lost business to a significant degree and also loss of reputation. But the recovery from Siemens' embedded corruption, while surely not perfect, has gone reasonably well. So consider the wide range of angles from which the problem was addressed, which to some extent mirror some of the things we have talked about here today. First, there were serious consequences for offenders, namely dismissal, recognizing that mild punishments can be worse than none. Importantly, high-level people who were one way or another implicated in the scandal were dismissed and replaced with executives often brought in from other companies that had strong track records of running ethical businesses. Apart from any practical insight into that task those people might bring, this change was highly visible and symbolized to people inside and outside the company that things were going to change radically. The new management team engaged in the important task of undermining and replacing the narratives that had rationalized corruption in the past. Specifically, the idea that we need to pay bribes to get the business was replaced with the idea that reliance on bribery to get business was actually undermining attention to product quality and thus hurting the company in the long run. So in effect, the company's strategic goals were reinterpreted so that anti-corruption became an essential part of company strategy due to its presumed link to product quality and thus sales and revenue. These new executives got out in the field and intensively interacted with employees and also with customers, suppliers, and government officials and others to understand what people expected of the company and to understand what the problems were, to rebuild trust with everyone, and importantly, to make clear to employees that the company was leaving behind its old ways. They also offered amnesty for low-level functionaries on the periphery and observers of the corruption to encourage further discovery of the extent of the problem and to rebuild a climate of trust and cooperation. Accountability in the organization was restructured. Mid-level managers would now be held accountable for preventing corruption in their areas of responsibility, something that was entirely new. And new staff and reporting relationships were put in place to encourage ethical business behavior. They also worked with other businesses to engage in a kind of collective industry-wide action against corruption on the grounds that as long as other people are paying bribes, it's going to be tough for our employees to refrain from paying bribes because that's what the competitors do. In short, the response to Siemens' failure was both formal and informal, substantive and symbolic, incorporating talk, listening, and action, and presenting a consistent message across all fronts.
So I'm just going to offer about 1 minute because we want to get, I know Brandon has remarks and allow time for questions and discussion. Just 1 minute, sort of a wrap up here. So what can we take away from our panel discussion today? First, I think, would be to encourage everyone to define the crisis broadly. Yes, the sexual abuse of minors is probably the most unimaginably awful aspect of it. But there's elements that are related, and we need to think and consider all aspects and all manifestations of the crisis. The crisis is complex, and we need to look for complex understandings of its causes as well as solutions. Also, too, simply passing new formal policies and rules are unlikely to solve the crisis. As Gary noted, the informal is critically important. Issues, bigger issues, culture, leadership, and other factors must be addressed, even though they're probably a lot harder to fix than simply passing new policies. Third, I don't think anyone wins if we politicize the crisis. The crisis spans many decades across multiple pontificates. If anything, this shows how the problems in the church are in part institutional in nature, and really deep-rooted. A top-down approach from the Vatican and from our bishops won't work. Bishops and the Vatican are part of the problem over many decades. They can't be the only ones to provide and implement solutions. We must look to priests. We must look to the laity for a broader perspective. And rather than a national, organized source of action, at the end of the day, each bishop needs to take action. Also, our leaders must be open to challenging viewpoints. In terms of specific organizational behavior research prescriptions, I'll just simply say this: we need research. We need to look into the past, even if it's painful. We need to understand what happened and why it happened so that we can make sure it doesn't happen again. We also need to look forward to new research. We should be understanding what is going on in each diocese with our priests. We need to be looking at diverse perspectives, not just asking seminary leadership, but seminary faculty what's going on. What ideas do they have for improving our formation, training, and education? Bottom line is, we can't be afraid to ask questions and deal with whatever it is that we find from studying this.
I want to thank me and join me in thanking our presenters for this fascinating presentation. Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much for your insights, and I think there is certainly a lot that we can learn from the field of organizational behavior and how crises in other kinds of organizations unfold and are solved, and how that might transfer over to the study of the church. Organizational sociologists would look at the church as any other social structure with its particular powers and capacities, powers for good as well as evil, powers that are differently activated and differently inhibited in different socio-historic contexts. And from that vantage point, I have a few questions, again, in terms of how we might examine other aspects of organizations. And so one of these questions that might be pertinent is on the role of institutional logics and cultural logics, and I think you've touched on it in terms of the role of culture in organizations. But there is a rich body of research in this field of institutional logics, and one of the insights they might offer, and this field looks at different institutional spheres, say corporations, professions, the state, family, community, religion, as having their own unique internal logics. And so when everyone seems really puzzled as to the extent of this cover-up, why were so many bishops and perhaps even popes complicit, the critique often seems to betray the expectation that they should have followed a kind of industrial bureaucratic logic in which violations of a policy and failure of compliance lead to swift termination of perpetrators, right? But what if that is an alien logic, right, to how they operate? What if they operated from a different institutional logic in which those actions don't quite make sense? What if the logic of the hierarchy has been primarily domestic rather than industrial, right? A domestic order of worth that is primarily a brotherhood, with loyalty as one of its key values, and in its debased forms, this is also the logic of the frat house and the mafia, right? This is the logic of the family where the dirty uncle who molests your kids, continues his behavior because he's also your brother whom you love, and you don't keep him away from your kids, and you don't consider reporting him to the police, and this sort of thing has been going on for centuries. Industrial logic doesn't make sense from that point of view. You don't institutionalize some kind of formal contract, some formal legal policy in a family, right? So there are those sorts of issues as to whether a mismatch of logics has either caused or exacerbated the crisis. Someone else had brought up another aspect of this domestic logic, which is one in which the bishop would see himself primarily as a loyal spouse to the flock, right? Willing to die to protect them. When is that activated and when is that inhibited? And I think there are bishops I've spoken to who think that in the current structure, this is inhibited because you're regularly transferred around, right? So it's moving people around makes it really hard to commit. It's hard to bond with your flock, and your loyalty turns primarily to the office and maybe to the fraternal bond with others like yourself. I've spoken to many priests who say, I don't get close to anyone in the parish because I know I'm leaving in 4 years, so I don't want to put myself in the position of having to deal with that emotional challenge. But this sort of thing shapes dispositions, not necessarily intentional deliberative actions, right? It shapes what comes naturally to people versus what takes considerable will to resist. And so perhaps that's why we hear many bishops using words like tragic to describe the situation rather than evil, right? And it reveals perhaps there is a sense of feeling tragically trapped between competing loyalties. But it raises the question for me of what does it take to change institutional logic successfully? And I wonder if you might have any examples from either your research or research in the field more broadly of management as to what does it take to, even in the Siemens case, what does it take to change not just the structure but the culture of an organization, and what would it take to change, say, a corrupted domestic logic? I don't know if we want a more necessarily institutional bureaucratic logic in the Catholic Church, but what would it take to rectify to its more elevated form? Another question that I think we need to consider is what is unique. I mean, we've talked about some of these processes of organizational behavior and structure and culture almost in universal terms, but what is unique to this particular socio-historic context, and to what extent is what we're seeing the legacy of modernity and the sexual revolution, for instance, and to what extent is it indicating some inherent structural problems that span time and space. So last time at one of these panels, Professor Carlos Ayer from Yale presented a fascinating case from the work of Karen Liebreich, a historian who discovered systematic abuse and cover-ups in the 17th century that look very much like what we're seeing today. And this is the case of the Piarist order that ran schools that were initially aimed at educating the poor and later on became these elite private academies. And they educated children, including people like Mozart and Goya and Schubert and Victor Hugo and so on, astronomers and kings and so forth. And her book investigates why this order was suddenly abolished by Pope Innocent X in 1646. And what she found was the founder of the order, Saint José de Calazans, knew of the scandal and tried to keep it secret. Then this was a very similar kind of case of, it started with a notorious priest, Father Cherubini, who was the headmaster of one of their schools, who systematically abused the pupils in his care and then essentially groomed a network of pederasts, and cardinals and bishops actively participated in this cover-up. And this guy was open with his transgressions. Everybody knew about it. And when Calazans came to know of them, he couldn't do very much because Cherubini was from a very powerful family, and nobody wanted to offend them. And so, and he even went on to say, look, if you make public these allegations of abuse, then I'm going to take actions to destroy the order. And so Calazans essentially promoted him to try and get him out of there. And he knew what Cherubini was doing, and there's historical records that, to quote his words, he wanted to cover up this great shame in order that it does not come to the notice of our superiors, right? So the logic seems, in some respects, very similar to what we've seen in the United States in the past 50 years or so. But there is something unique, too, about this idea that you don't want to offend a powerful family. I mean, that's a particular kind of logic that we don't find governing our actions today. So again, there's this question of how you think about the specific socio-historic context that activates certain organizational mechanisms and inhibit them. And there's also additional research in the field of management on when emphasis on compliance can increase unethical behavior, right? When certainly, I think you touched on it, but the research suggests that it's when people see the pursuit of compliance as a business decision rather than a moral decision or an ethical decision. And I wonder if there is any such danger in thinking that adding more policies will solve our problem here. And finally, I want to ask if you have any examples of what it might take to overcome what you called this lovely at the top phenomenon. What does it take to encourage either a culture of whistleblowing or a vulnerability on the part of the leader where they're receptive to criticism and receptive to being told that they're not doing things correctly and need to change? If you have any examples of that, or especially what it would take to create such a culture when the current case is that it's not so.
Gee, well, that's an awful lot.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, you go.
Why don't I start with institutional...
You have 5 minutes to answer all these questions.
I'll start with institutional logics because I saw Mike looking at me when Brandon raised that question, okay? And then you can think about the other three.
Yeah.
All right? So I think your question was What has to happen to change what Brandon referred to as an institutional logic? Fancy sociology word for kind of the collection of taken for granted practices and also cognitive assumptions, attitudes, beliefs, routine ways of doing things that, in a sense, are structured in a particular environment, whether it's a particular industry, in the church, in government, whatever it might be, so deeply embedded, so structured that a lot of the people in it don't even see it. It's the water that the fish swim in that sense, okay? And so what, I won't say it's the only way these things can change, but one way they change is when there is a crisis, which actually gets people to pay attention to and ask, what's been going on here? What are we doing? How did we get into this position? Okay? That's one way. It also can happen because there are simply a few people who actively want to do something different, change that institutional order, and over time slowly recruit others into that effort, presenting to people an alternative way of thinking, an alternative way of doing things. But in either of those cases, crisis resolution or response to crisis or kind of institutional entrepreneurs trying to change something, what makes it work is essentially their access to things like societal power and influence, having the right kind of connections, economic resources, the symbolic power of what they say, what else it connects to, okay? And you can be surprised how this works sometimes. So, for example, in Palermo in Sicily, there has been a small group of business people. It was actually 7 or 8 people about 30 years old who wanted to start a tavern and did not want to, at the time, pay the usual mafia extortion payments that most other businesses in Palermo paid. So in a sense, these 7 or 8 people were taking on the mafia, and surprisingly, they were successful. They started from nothing, but what they put together was the right network of other supporters, off the radar at first, so nobody got legs broken. Other supporters, certain kinds of economic resources from area businesses, some support from government and so forth, and eventually were able to carve out for themselves and other businesses a kind of pizzo, a kind of extortion-free zone within that mafia-influenced economy. On the other hand, there have been big companies operating in corruption and heavy environments that maybe spent $300 or $400 million trying to fix things and got nowhere, because even though they had a lot of the economic resources, they did not have the sort of symbolic social network sort of influences that would let them actually change people's mindset. So I don't know if I've answered your question enough, Brandon, or if I should let Mike talk about something else for a minute.
I'll talk about something else. I think you answered that well. But I'll just say about one other thing, because I am sensitive there might be questions, so I don't want to tackle all those things that Brandon asked us to. I'll just latch onto the last one, lovely at the top, right? That's that phenomenon where people, leaders at the top of the organization, information, bad news especially, doesn't always reach up to them. They often have a perception that things are better in the organization than they realize. I think there's 2 prescriptions for that. The first is information on an ongoing basis. So in a typical business organizations will do annual or every other year surveys of the people in the organization or constituencies associated with the organization. They're anonymous, third-party administration. Could also be done with interviews, again, by third party, so people can provide negative anonymous feedback. And really, that kind of information can help a bishop, I think, get a sense, get a pulse of what's actually happening in his organization. Because no one wants to be the person that is the messenger that gets shot, right, to deliver that bad news. The other part is sort of, I think, though, a change in leadership style, right? As you mentioned earlier, this idea that I think sometimes people are demonized for speaking up. It's frightening to voice bad news, but to have that kind of leadership style of someone who's a listener, is not going to punish someone for telling them something that they need to know. even if it's uncomfortable. And that takes humility. That takes a deliberate style of leadership. And I think both of those things are very important. And then that's all.
And maybe I can, in 60 seconds, answer the other two questions, okay? So first of all, in terms of the influence of the larger cultural environment, which I hinted at, and I think Mike did too at one point, if you think back to what people have been saying about American society in its development over the last 50 years, we do find, say, going back to Philip Rieff and Christopher Lasch and other people in the 60s and 70s, ever-increasing complaints about the development of a kind of narcissistic and therapeutic society. Well, candidates for the priesthood come from the church, but they also come from America. So yeah, it's perfectly relevant to look into those kinds of things. Secondly, on the problems of focusing on compliance, rules, and regulations, that's why I started with what I did, okay? Because the temptation for a lot of businesses and other organizations, government and so forth, is to, there's a problem, let's throw the rules at them. But like that manager I talked about who said he'd never take a problem to his company's ethics and compliance office, that's just because the rules, regulations are perceived as they're out to get me. In fact, in that particular organization, when you got off the elevator at the compliance office, what you saw was a big mural of 19th century police officers swinging their sticks, okay? And so, you know, the symbolism of the program there was terrible. You know, it's not we're here to help you, we're here to catch you in the act. And in fact, the more people we catch, the better the compliance office looks,
Right.
okay? And so that's the kind of message you need to avoid, or people will tune out the message. They will not see the rules and regulations as an expression of who we are and want to be that's helping us, but rather simply as an imposition to be avoided.
Great, thank you so much. We have about 15 minutes for questions.
Maybe not.
That lady back there.
Hi, thank you. This is for Dr. Weaver about the point you made earlier with weak punishments.
Could you quickly introduce yourself? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, my name's Sarah Ritchie. I'm a senior at the Catholic University of America. This is for Dr. Weaver. Earlier you said that weak punishments can be worse than no punishments for the clergy or in an organization by creating a cost-benefit analysis. Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure.
Oh, sorry, please.
Suppose I'm considering doing something bad, okay? I try not to do, but it happens even to me, of course. Anyway, as I am thinking about that, what am I thinking? Well, hopefully I'm thinking, you know, that's not the kind of person I am. It's not what the church teaches. It's not being a good citizen. You know, all these reasons can come to mind where those reasons are rooted in my sense of who I am as somebody who likes to think of himself as a reasonably moral and upright person, okay? And that's often enough to dissuade people from doing the wrong thing, okay? That sort of inconsistency of the bad action with their sense of who they are. When you put a punishment in front of them, what happens, and this is research done, Ten Brunzel and Messick, was that in the 1990s? I think so. Yeah, this is research done by Ann Ten Brunzel, who's at Notre Dame now, and Dave Messick, who's retired.
Closer to the mic, please.
Okay, sorry. Closer to the mic.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway, what their research showed was that when you put the punishment in place in front of somebody, what happens is you change the way of thinking from, is this the kind of person I am, that sort of thing, into, oh, well, if I do this, that will happen. So you have changed it into a calculating mindset instead of a moral identity kind of mindset. And as soon as I'm looking at the trade-offs, then the punishment better be strong enough. In other words, people shift the way they will think from one time to another. I could be thinking in terms of, you know, my sense of moral identity. I could just be looking at it in terms of what do I get out of it, cost and benefits. So if you're going to risk shifting people into that cost and benefit calculating mindset, the calculation better come out right. Okay?
Good point.
I think the lady back there had a question.
There's one over there.
Hi, I'm Sharon O'Brien with Catholics for Family Peace and the National Catholic School of Social Service here. I understand that there's such a thing as a bishop boot camp, that once a priest has been tapped to be bishop, they get scheduled to go to Rome for a bishop's boot camp. And I wonder if anyone can speak to whether these organizational behavioral strategies are part of the agenda.
Not knowing what's actually in that boot camp makes that hard to answer. I mean, sort of on the surface, it would seem wonderful. That gets to some of the socialization, the training, the kinds of backgrounds. I guess even sort of antecedent to that, I'm just curious about the whole selection process of bishops. It seems to be that if you go out to the USCCB website, there's actually a little section on how bishops are selected, right? And it seems like there's an awful lot of an emphasis on personal recommendations. Hey, I know somebody who'd be pretty good. I'm sure it's much more formal than that, and those qualities I mentioned earlier. I just wonder, as part of that boot camp, or even the reality, priests are so young and they're put into leadership roles. Are they getting any kind of that leadership training? I mean, as much as I talked to a young seminarian recently, and I talked to a vocations director at a diocese, and both said, yeah, a lot of the young guys, and as a young guy, said the seminarian, like, I really want to be a priest. He didn't see his priestly role as being like an administrator. He didn't want to be, right? And not that those can be entirely separated, but I just wonder what that boot camp would entail. What are we actually preparing them for? And are they prepared for all aspects of their job and that role? And as challenging as it is, I don't know how you could prepare someone for that. I just think it's got to be one of the hardest jobs on earth, because those are just, you have to be, figuratively speaking, ambidextrous, right? To really balance. I think CEOs have a hard enough time when they're focused only on the bottom line to once in a while be socially responsible. Here you're talking, these you have to be excellent at both. And so I don't know, I didn't really answer your question, but I think it's in theory that sounds good. I just don't know what's actually in there, and I'm not exactly confident that there probably is the stuff that they would need.
There's a gentleman back there.
Thank you. I'm just a retired federal bureaucrat, all right? In my experience, institutional change requires some sort of supporting mechanism, something people do every day or see every day that reinforces the change. Can you give us examples from your experience of specific institutional mechanisms that organizations have used to support these changes?
Yeah, we both can probably come up with some. So partly the obvious things that organizations do are part of this. So the policies, the codes of ethics, reward systems, discipline, all those kinds of things are important. But what also is important then is the way people respond to those, the way they interpret them. And that's where the more informal things, the behavior of department heads, other people in leadership positions really comes into play, because that frames whether those policies and programs and procedures are things that I think are there to help me or things I need to avoid and work around. So yeah, in the corporate world, this kind of thing, having these sorts of formal policies and such, goes way back to the 1970s, following some of the defense industry scandals back then. And it became a condition of being a eligible defense contractor that you had to have these sorts of processes in place. But one of the lessons they learned early on was we can't just throw the rules and rewards and punishments at people. It's got to be more than that, or it becomes ineffective for the reasons I mentioned earlier. I don't know if you want to add to that, Mike.
Yeah, I'll just add an example. So Gary and I, we didn't overlap, but we both got our PhDs, or one of your PhDs, at Penn State University main campus in business administration, and I teach at our second largest campus in the Penn State system up in Erie, Pennsylvania, Penn State Behrend. We had an incident some years ago, many of you might be familiar with our football program at the main campus, right? Yeah. Chuckle, yeah, unfortunately, you are. And that was very painful, even though we're almost 200 miles away. We don't have a football team at my campus, but we all identified as one university. And that was a very painful chapter because it really was someone who was a hero in the organization. Joe Paterno was the head coach, and I still believe him to be a decent person. I don't think he tried covering up something or anything like that, but his legacy was forever tarnished as a result of that. But following and it was the actions of an assistant coach who had been abusing children apparently for quite some time. Some of the formal ways of changing were the formal policies, right? So training. I have more clearances, FBI investigations, it seems like, just to work at Penn State, even though most of the students that we deal with are not minors. But there could be minors on campus. So the level of compliance, I think, is as high as you would expect now in the church where I volunteer and coach youth sports through our diocesan's athletic program. I'm clearanced out, you know. So there's those formal aspects of it, training, posters that remind us, though, of our Penn State values. And I think that's more the cultural change that Gary mentioned earlier. Those visible reminders when I go in the copy room about who we are, not just we need to do this so we don't get in trouble. We need to do this to protect the institution. We need it because, risk management says we need this. There is still an element of the compliance, and Gary's done the research on this, it's both the values, the aspirational, and the compliance together. And that's the message. I go back, I'm a leadership guy. That's leadership, right? Leaders are the ones talking about it, communicating it, reinforcing it, that we're doing this not just to protect the institution, we're doing because it makes us a better institution. Of who we want to be and what we stand for. Not what we not want to do. It's not the Ten Commandments. It's the Beatitudes, right? This is who we want to be.
Yeah, and if I can just follow up by using the Paterno case for a different purpose to kind of reiterate what we've talked about. If you think of the kind of condensed, brief, popular narrative of that Penn State scandal, what's it about? It's about Jerry Sandusky, the evil assistant coach. It's about Joe Paterno, who let it happen. And maybe it's about Graham Spanier, right, the university president. In other words, the tendency is to look for the bad guy, look for the evil perpetrator. But in fact, that couldn't have happened without a lot of other support, both from either flawed formal systems or from the large from the informal relationships, reputations, and things like that of people involved. So Sandusky partly was able to get away with what he did because he had such a good reputation in the community, doing charitable things, that people simply couldn't believe he would do this. So again, we tend to focus on let's get the bad guys and get rid of them. It's actually almost always a much bigger picture. And the Penn State case, looked at in the abstract, isn't a lot different from a lot of other organizational scandals.
Right there.
I must need to be heard. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
good. We're at a point where there is just a dramatic crisis of exodus from the Catholic Church and from other denominations as well. At the same time, South America, I understand, has a huge, rapid growth of Catholics joining other groups that are not Catholic in a remarkable way, attesting to their religious beliefs. With this crisis, which I don't believe is the first here, I'm old enough to remember maybe 30 years ago, a guy walking around near the National Cathedral with posters about get rid of the pedophiles in the clergy, and that was a big revelation back then, and it was like they're going to do something about it. And now 30 years later, we're talking about the crisis of faith or whatever it is. Can the church be in a position where possibly enough people say, to heck with this, that's irreparable. How can we go back and trust these people and just walk away. I mean, I'm talking about an extreme example, but in terms of what you guys have been talking about, which has been really key in the larger sense, people have turned to alternative means of getting some kind of a spiritual connection, if that's important to them, or material connections, et cetera, getting their kids in the best schools, et cetera. They can get along, they think, without God. And then we have his intermediaries that define themselves as sacred, holy. Couldn't the people just say, hey, you've gone the way of the Edsel? And en masse, something radical starting and just picking up like wildfire?
Not really. I want to actually add to it and throw it to you. I want
I
to.
might add something, but you can start.
But I do want to sort of connect that, actually, thank you for the question. I think I do want to connect that a little bit to your Siemens example, right, where you had to have a lot of very visible symbolic changes happen, right? So what does it take to rebuild trust once it's been broken? My worry with some of the framing of crisis of faith kind of language is that it, I think, can exacerbate the pressure to sweep further things under the rug and say, oh, we don't want to add, bring anything more to light because already so many people are turning away from the faith, right? So are there any sort of serious, major structural or symbolic changes that visibly need to occur in order to rebuild trust based on, what you've seen in other kinds of organizations? And then certainly, what are the risks of sort of mass exit of some sort?
I think also to answer that question, and I'm not a sociologist of religion, but I think I would need to be to answer that. We need to look carefully at who exactly is leaving, okay? Are these deeply involved, committed members who are leaving? Are these people who have been on the margins for a long time and they're looking for an excuse to finally tell themselves that, yeah, Sunday morning soccer practice really is more important than going to church? Are they people who have been sort of peripherally attached to the church because of third generation ethnic ties or something like that? I think the crisis as a rationale or sometimes rationalization for leaving probably affects a lot of different groups of people in different ways. So I'll just mention that, and I will say for something of this magnitude where the institution itself is built on a kind of moral message in a way that, say, Siemens Corporation is not, rebuilding the trust probably faces a higher bar.
Mike, do you want to?
Follow
All
up?
right, I think we're at time right now, so if you could. Right. Thanks. We could. Yeah.
In 10 seconds, maybe some of that's due to the crisis. Maybe some of that is the larger cultural trends we are seeing across the West, first in Europe, now in North America. It's really hard to parse that out, which is the bigger influence there.
Once again, thank you so much to our presenters, and thank you all for your questions as well.
Thanks, Candace. Thank you.